Okay, tonight we're entering a cabin where silence lingers heavier than the scent of pine, and where the darkness of human intent left its mark not in screams, but in the eerie stillness that followed. Welcome to Criminal Mindcast, the podcast where we tell true crime stories not just with facts, but with silence, with the haunting weight of what was never said. Here, the echoes of what happened and what didn't hang in the cold air like a warning. Tonight we explore the Keddie cabin murders, a case steeped in shadows, whispered through 4 decades of fear, a remote mountain cabin, a small community's secret wounds, and a mystery that refuses to rest. Keddie, California, in the early 1980s, was a place where isolation was both sanctuary and vulnerability. The town was little more than a scattering of cabins nestled deep within the Sierra Nevada mountains. Life here was simple, quiet, and, on the surface, almost idyllic. But beneath the calm exterior of this rustic community were undercurrents of poverty, fractured relationships, and unspoken tensions, fault lines waiting to give way under the weight of tragedy. The family at the center of this case, the Sharps, had come to Keddie seeking a fresh start. Glenna Sue Sharp, a mother of 5, had moved her children from Connecticut to California, following a divorce from her abusive husband. The decision was born from desperation and hope, as many relocations are. Yet, in leaving one darkness behind, she unknowingly stepped into another. Sue Sharp was by all accounts a resilient woman, resourceful, self-reliant, and fiercely protective of her children. She worked multiple jobs to keep the family afloat, supplementing meager income with food assistance programs. Life in Cabin 28 was far from comfortable, but it offered something closer to safety than what they had left behind. At least, that was the belief. Sue Sharp's children, John, Sheila, Tina, Rick, and Greg, fit the familiar rhythms of small-town life in rural America. John, the eldest at 17, balanced uneasily on the threshold between adolescence and adulthood. He craved independence, testing his own limits, yet he remained firmly tied to his responsibilities within the family. Sheila, just a step younger, carried herself with quiet resilience, while 12-year-old Tina tended to drift inward, a soft-spoken dreamer often more comfortable in her own imagination than in the noise of family life. The younger boys, Rick and Greg, provided constant movement and chatter, their boundless energy a reminder of the innocence still protecting them from the harsher realities that pressed close around their household. Neighbors in Keddie remembered the Sharps as a polite, unassuming family. They kept mostly to themselves, never disruptive, never deliberately calling attention. Yet in a town as compact as Keddie, privacy was rare. Curiosity moved easily through the community, carried in hushed conversations and subtle glances. Some spoke of Sue's financial difficulties, noting the weight she carried as a single mother. Others speculated about the men who occasionally came to the cabin. It was nothing overtly scandalous, simply the kind of scrutiny that seems to thrive in small, close-knit places where lives are woven tightly together. The broader context of the town is important. Keddie was a community in decline, a place where economic hardship and social isolation could distort perceptions and feed resentments. Residents lived with an uneasy awareness that while everyone knew everyone else, they did not necessarily understand them. Secrets were tucked behind cabin walls, and grudges lingered unspoken. In criminology, these conditions, economic stress, insularity, and latent tension, are recognized as fertile ground for violence. This case did not emerge from nowhere. Signs of fracture existed long before the night of the murders. Sue Sharp's protective parenting style and her insistence on keeping her family close had drawn criticism from some neighbors. There were vague reports of arguments overheard and of John mixing with older, rougher crowds. The line between adolescent rebellion and dangerous association was thin, and the consequences of crossing it devastating. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this background is its ordinariness. The Sharps were not a family living on the edge of criminality or scandal. They were simply trying to survive. Yet within that fragile pursuit of stability lay the perfect vulnerability, economic fragility, social isolation, and a mother's trust in a town that could not protect her. The psychological profile of the victim suggests lives shaped by resilience but shadowed by constant low-level stress. Trauma researchers often note that such conditions heighten sensitivity to threats, even imagined ones. But no one in Cabin 28 seemed to sense the level of danger they were in. No one, it seems, expected that a predator, or perhaps more than one, was circling so close. In constructing a psychological frame for the suspect or suspects, the setting becomes critical. Whoever committed the crime did not stumble upon Cabin 28 randomly. They knew the geography, the layout, and perhaps even the people inside. The attack required familiarity, not only with the cabin, but with the rhythms of its occupants' lives. Whether through obsession, resentment, or opportunity, the killer's intent was born not of randomness but of proximity. The Keddie cabin case carries a suffocating weight, not only because of its brutality, but because of the intimacy of its setting. Though the wilderness around Keddie stretched wide and untamed, the social world of the town was remarkably small. Everyone knew or thought they knew everyone else. That closeness made the crime feel all the more unsettling. Whoever committed the murders likely belonged to that very fabric of daily life, familiar enough to observe routines, close enough to slip unnoticed into the fragile rhythms of the Sharp family. The terrifying possibility remains that the killer, or killers, stood shoulder to shoulder with neighbors in the aftermath, blending grief with deception. Criminologists often describe such cases as the collision of two realities, the comfort of familiarity and the danger of proximity. In isolated communities, the distinction between friend and predator can dissolve with shocking speed. Cabin 28 was not just a dwelling, it became a pressure point where Sue Sharp's attempt to carve out stability for her children intersected fatally with the darker forces that hid beneath small-town courtesies. By the night of April 11, 1981, the stage was already set. Daily struggles, fleeting tensions, and unspoken fears coalesced in ways no one could foresee. What followed defied explanation. A crime so violent it shattered not only a family, but the town's sense of itself. Yet to understand it, Keddie must be remembered not merely as the site of horror, but as a fragile community, where the illusion of safety could be undone in a single night. On the evening of April 11, 1981, Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort appeared like any other modest home preparing to settle into the quiet of a spring night. The Sharp family had returned from errands and visits with friends, the rhythms of their lives seemingly ordinary, their plans unremarkable. Yet somewhere in the surrounding darkness, intent was hardening into action. John Sharp, 17, had been spending time with his friend Dana Wingate, a young man known to drift between small jobs and minor trouble, but without the reputation of serious violence. The two boys had been seen hitchhiking earlier that day, a common practice among teens in rural areas, and reportedly attended a party before returning to Cabin 28. Sheila Sharp, the oldest daughter, was away at a nearby friend's home for a sleepover, a small accident of circumstance that would ultimately save her life. Inside the cabin as night fell were Sue Sharp, her younger sons Rick and Greg, their friend Justin, and eventually John and Dana. Tina, the 12-year-old, had been watching television and spending time with her mother earlier, unaware that she would soon be drawn into the most chilling aspect of the entire case. Neighbors later recalled the evening as unremarkable, the kind of still night where sound carries easily across the resort. Yet no one reported hearing what would come next. Not a scream, not a struggle, not even the telltale crash of chaos breaking loose. Instead, the cabin became a sealed container for an eruption of violence so sudden and decisive that it left investigators decades later unable to reconstruct the exact sequence of events. What is known, or at least accepted, is grim. At some point after 10 p.m., one or more assailants entered Cabin 28. The method of entry remains uncertain. There were no signs of forced access, suggesting the door may have been unlocked or that the victims had let their killer in willingly, an unsettling implication of familiarity. The living room of Cabin 28 became the stage for unspeakable violence. John Sharp and his friend Dana Wingate were attacked first, bludgeoned and bound with tape and electrical cords. Sue Sharp endured a similar fate, beaten and stabbed with a ferocity that suggested rage rather than necessity. Yet details resisted simple explanation. Dana bore ligature marks consistent with strangulation, hinting at control more than chaos. Sue's injuries, showing restraint alongside targeted assault, pointed to a killer with possible personal grievance. Meanwhile, in the adjoining bedroom, 3 young boys, Rick, Greg, and Justin, remained untouched. Whether intentionally spared or overlooked is still debated. Investigators noted the noise and violence should have woken them, yet they remained silent, a chilling suggestion that the assailant maintained unnerving composure throughout the attack. The most haunting mystery was Tina. When Sheila Sharp discovered the scene the next morning, she found her mother, brother, and Dana dead. The younger boys alive but in shock. Tina, however, was gone. No struggle, no sign of where she had been taken. For years, her disappearance cast a shadow over the case, until 1984, when her skeletal remains surfaced in a remote Feather Falls area more than 50 miles away. The condition of the bones and time elapsed erased vital forensic evidence, leaving only speculation. Why was Tina taken while the others were left? Some believe she was the intended target from the beginning, with the murders staged to mask an abduction. Others argue she witnessed something that sealed her fate. Whatever the motive, Tina's abduction deepened the mystery, ensuring that Cabin 28 would be remembered not only for brutality but for haunting, unanswered questions. The scene within Cabin 28 defies simple interpretation. Blood patterns suggested multiple weapons, hammer, knife, and possibly another unidentified object, indicating either a single offender who switched tools mid-assault or multiple attackers working in concert. The disarray of the crime scene, with furniture overturned and walls marked by smears of blood, hinted at a chaotic struggle. Yet certain elements, carefully tied bindings, selective violence, spoke to deliberation rather than frenzy. Equally perplexing was the absence of fingerprints or clear forensic evidence linking a suspect to the scene. This, investigators concluded, pointed to an offender who took calculated steps to obscure their presence, perhaps wiping surfaces or wearing gloves. Such foresight contradicts the brutality of the attack, suggesting a killer both capable of impulsive violence and methodical concealment, a combination rare and deeply unsettling. The timeline of the murders stretches into the early morning hours of April 12th. Yet the silence surrounding Cabin 28 remained unbroken until Sheila S.'s return. No neighbors reported disturbances, and no one saw strange vehicles departing the resort at odd hours. The killers had vanished as completely as they had appeared, leaving behind only carnage and confusion. In the aftermath, investigators struggled to piece together the sequence of events, hindered by compromised evidence and procedural missteps. But even stripped of forensics, the timeline itself tells a psychological story. The murders were neither random nor purely opportunistic. The offender, or offenders, likely harbored a personal connection to the victims, a grievance that justified, in their mind, the intimate brutality of the attack. Yet here lies the paradox that keeps the Keddie case suspended in mystery. If the killer was driven by rage or revenge, why take Tina? If the crime was planned, why leave 3 young witnesses alive? If secrecy was paramount, why inflict such dramatic violence that ensured discovery and media attention? Each detail contradicts another, leaving only an impression of calculated chaos, an act choreographed to obliterate clarity. The timeline closes not with resolution, but with absence. The bodies in the living room, the stunned survivors in their room, the empty space where Tina should have been. The night that began with mundane routines had ended in a tableau of horror that even today resists explanation. And as dawn broke over the Sierra Nevadas, Keddie ceased to be just another mountain community. It became the epicenter of a mystery that would haunt the American true crime landscape for decades to come.
The investigation into the Keddie cabin murders began within hours of Sheila Sharp's harrowing discovery. Yet from its earliest stages, the inquiry was marked by missteps that would echo through the decades, leaving the case mired in uncertainty and public frustration. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department arrived quickly, but the scene they encountered was both chaotic and already compromised. Neighbors, law enforcement, and emergency responders had entered and exited Cabin 28 before proper perimeter control was established, inadvertently trampling potential evidence. Initial observations confirmed the brutality of the attack, but beyond that, clarity was scarce. Investigators struggled to determine whether one killer or multiple assailants had been involved. Some evidence suggested a coordinated effort, such as the use of different weapons and the complexity of the bindings. Other indicators, including the sheer violence of the assault and the random scattering of items, pointed toward a frenzied lone attacker. Yet no clear forensic link, no fingerprints, no definitive DNA would provide a conclusive answer. Compounding the difficulty was the absence of Tina Sharp. The missing girl transformed an already gruesome homicide into a layered mystery, one that combined murder with potential abduction. The question of why Tina had been taken and whether she was still alive dominated the early phase of the investigation. Search teams combed the surrounding woods, aided by dogs and helicopters, but no trace was found. The sense of dread deepened as days turned into weeks, and theories began to splinter. One of the earliest suspects was a man named Marty Smart, a Keddie resident with a history of violence and unstable behavior. He had reportedly expressed disdain for Sue Sharp and allegedly made incriminating statements to acquaintances after the murders. According to one account, Smart told a counselor that he believed the victims had been punished for perceived slights, a claim investigators initially dismissed as unreliable hearsay. Years later, recovered notes and audio recordings would suggest his statements might have been far more serious than previously thought. Another figure of interest was Bao Ubud, a transient acquaintance of Smart who had been staying with him around the time of the murders. Theories emerged that the two men may have acted together, possibly in connection with illicit activities or unresolved personal conflicts involving Sue Sharp. Yet neither was formally charged, and key investigative leads were allowed to wither as the case grew cold. The community of Keddie, meanwhile, found itself gripped by fear and suspicion. In small towns, trust is often implicit, a shared assumption that neighbors are allies rather than threats. The murders shattered that bond. Residents began locking doors, avoiding late-night walks, and quietly speculating about who among them might have harbored such lethal darkness. Paranoia seeped into everyday interactions, and whispered accusations traveled faster than facts. Media coverage intensified the unease. Regional outlets seized on the sensational nature of the crime for victims. One missing child, a picturesque wilderness setting. Headlines framed the case as a mountain massacre, turning Cabin 28 into an icon of rural horror. Yet as attention grew, so too did public scrutiny of law enforcement. Commentators and local citizens alike criticized the investigation's early mismanagement, from contaminated evidence to the slow pace of forensic testing. Theories multiplied, each more unsettling than the last. Some posited that the murders were the work of a drifter passing through, a theory weakened by the lack of stolen items or signs of opportunistic robbery. Others believed the crime was personal, perhaps linked to Sue Sharp's past relationships or to conflicts within the tight-knit community. Still others ventured into darker speculation, suggesting a conspiracy to cover up deeper wrongdoing. When Tina's remains were discovered in 1984, the investigation was briefly revitalized. The skeletal remains were found in Butte County, more than 50 miles from Keddie, by a man searching for bottles near an isolated logging road. The distance and delay stripped investigators of valuable forensic clues, leaving only grim confirmation that Tina had not survived. Whether she had been killed on the night of the murders or later could not be determined. This discovery, rather than clarifying the case, only deepened its enigma. If Tina had been abducted alive, what happened during those intervening years? If she had been killed the same night, why move her body so far, risking detection? And perhaps most disturbing, why take her at all, leaving behind 3 young witnesses? These questions haunted both investigators and the public, fueling theories that alternately painted the killer as calculating, impulsive, or sadistic. Over the years, advances in forensic science offered glimmers of hope. DNA tester, unavailable in 1981, was later applied to surviving evidence, though results have remained inconclusive. Renewed efforts by cold case specialists have uncovered overlooked clues, including a possible hammer believed to match one used in the murders, recovered years later from a nearby body of water. Yet even these findings have failed to produce an arrest, leaving the case to languish among America's most haunting unsolved crimes. Public reaction has shifted over time from shock to fascination to enduring unease. For residents of Keddie, the murders cast a long shadow, a reminder that violence can intrude even into the most secluded havens. For the wider true crime audience, the case has become emblematic of investigative failure and the limits of justice when evidence fades and witnesses die. Documentaries, podcasts, and books have revisited the case, each proposing new angles, new suspects, new interpretations. Yet none have delivered the closure sought by those who remember the victims not as symbols of mystery, but as people-children, a mother, a friend whose lives ended violently and without explanation. As criminologists often note, the public's relationship to unsolved cases is paradoxical. We crave resolution, yet we are drawn to the permanence of mystery. The Keddie murders, with their strange silences, missing evidence, and unresolved threads, embody the paradox completely. They leave us with questions that hover like ghosts' questions about motive, method, and meaning. And behind those questions lingers the unsettling possibility that the killer walked among the mourners, unrecognized, perhaps unrepentant, while the investigation faltered under the weight of what it failed to see. The Keddie cabin murders present not only a crime scene, but a psychological labyrinth. Understanding the mindset of the perpetrator or perpetrators requires examining the intersection of rage, control, and the eerie calm that follows calculated violence. Criminological theory often divides offenders into categories: organized, disorganized, or a hybrid of both. Yet this case blurs the distinctions, suggesting a killer whose emotional volatility was balanced by chilling foresight. The nature of the attack indicates more than random brutality. Sue Sharp was bound and gagged before being beaten and stabbed, suggesting an element of control beyond mere frenzy. Dana Wingate, or signs of strangulation, a method implying deliberate suppression rather than chaotic assault. These actions suggest a perpetrator who oscillated between impulsive violence and deliberate ritual, a psychological state where anger feeds precision rather than disrupting it. Why? Motive is often a window into a killer's psyche, but here the glass is opaque. If the murder stemmed from personal grievance, it suggests deep emotional investment, resentment, betrayal, or humiliation transformed into lethal resolve. If the motive was opportunistic, then the precision of the assault contradicts the expected randomness of such crimes. This paradox points toward a hybrid offender, one who arrived at cabin 28 with both emotional agitation and a grim sense of purpose. From a psychological standpoint, the abduction of Tina Sharp introduces an additional layer. Taking her while leaving other young witnesses alive suggests targeted intent. Was she perceived as a threat to the killer's secrecy, or as the true objective of the night's violence? Trauma research indicates that offenders who abduct victims post-crime often do so to maintain a sense of control over the narrative, over the fear they create, or over their victim's fate. Yet the lack of ransom demand or communication removes the element of leverage, leaving only the unsettling suggestion of fixation. Philosophical perspectives can also illuminate the shadows cast by this case. From a Stoic viewpoint, the murders represent the extreme consequences of unchecked passion, of an individual who allowed emotion to override reason entirely. Seneca wrote of anger as temporary madness, a force that blinds judgment and distorts reality. Yet here, madness alone cannot explain the level of planning required. Instead, one might see the act as the manifestation of what Marcus Aurelius called the corruption of the ruling faculty, reason turned inward, serving darkness instead of virtue. In contrast, Buddhist thought framed such violence through the lens of attachment and aversion, two forces said to lie at the root of human suffering. If the killer acted out of obsessive desire, unresolved grievance, or fear of exposure, each motive reflects a clinging to ego and illusion, a refusal to accept the impermanence of circumstance. From this perspective, the murders are less a mystery of identity and a case study in the destructive potential of human craving and delusion. Psychological profiling extends beyond the offender to encompass the surviving community. Small towns are ecosystems of trust, and when that trust is shattered by violence, the resulting trauma is collective. Residents of Keddie lived for decades under the weight of unresolved fear, suspicion, and grief, a dynamic known in forensic psychology as secondary victimization. The unsolved nature of the case prolonged the community's suffering, denying them the closure that might have allowed healing to begin. The aftermath for the surviving Sharp children was equally profound. Losing a mother and siblings under such circumstances inflicts a form of trauma often described as complicated grief, where mourning is compounded by shock, guilt, and unanswered questions. For Sheila Sharp, who discovered the bodies, the burden was especially heavy, a single moment etching itself into memory with unrelenting clarity. A reminder that survival sometimes carries its own unbearable weight. Modern criminological approaches suggest new avenues for investigation, even decades later. Advances in DNA technology, behavioral analysis, and forensic reconstruction offer tools unavailable to early investigators. Re-examining evidence for touch DNA, reassessing witness statements with contemporary profiling methods, and exploring potential connections to other unsolved cases in the region could yield breakthroughs. Yet time remains the greatest adversary. Physical evidence degrades, memories fade, and potential witnesses pass away. Still, the Keddie case endures as more than a puzzle of facts. It is a meditation on human darkness and the fragility of order. It forces us to confront the unsettling truth that the capacity for violence can exist alongside the mundane hidden in neighbors, acquaintances, or strangers passing quietly through our lives. It also highlights the limits of institutional justice, reminding us that not every crime yields to evidence and reason, that some truths dissolve into silence long before they can be named. In reflecting on the psychological aftermath, one sees not only the pain of loss, but the enduring resonance of fear. The Keddie cabin murders have inspired documentaries, books, and countless theories, each attempt at explanation reflecting a deeper need to impose meaning where horror has stripped it away. Perhaps this is why the case continues to haunt. It embodies what philosopher Søren Kierkegaard described as the dizziness of freedom, the realization that human choices, even those born of malice, can be terrifyingly arbitrary, leaving consequences beyond comprehension. Yet there remains a possibility, however faint, that the truth could emerge. Cold cases have been solved after decades through single fragments of DNA, rediscovered witness accounts, or the confessions of offenders burdened by conscience late in life. If such an outcome awaits Keddie, it will not erase the darkness of what occurred, but it may allow the victims and their families a measure of dignity long denied. Until then, the psychological legacy of Cabin 28 lingers an echo of violence that reveals as much about human nature as about human cruelty. It tells us that beneath the veneer of civility, forces of rage, obsession, and control can converge with terrifying precision. And it reminds us, in the quiet spaces between theory and evidence, that some crimes leave not answers, but shadows deep enough to swallow reason whole.
Fear is a mirror, and the Keddie cabin murders reflect the fragility of human life against the weight of violence. What began as an ordinary night in a mountain town ended as a mystery that has defied answers for more than 4 decades, leaving only fragments of motive and whispers of intent. Perhaps the lesson is not in solving the crime, but in acknowledging the silence it left behind, the silence of lost lives, of questions never asked, of truths too heavy to surface. We ask whether we truly want the whole story, or whether the mystery itself has become the only resolution we can bear. If this story has unsettled you, take a moment to like, share the video, and subscribe for more explorations into the shadows of the human mind. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.
References 1. Craven, D. 2021. The Keddie Murders, True Crime in the California Mountains. 2. Newton, M. 2014. The Encyclopedia of Unsolved Crimes. 3. King, G. 2016. Unsolved Mysteries of the 20th Century.